The desert wind never stopped. It moved through the forward operating base like a ghost, lifting grit into every seam of fabric and every crease of skin. The sun sat high and unblinking, baking the corrugated metal walls until they shimmered. Sergeant Elena Vega stood at the edge of the motor pool, boots planted, her black hair pinned up beneath a sweat-darkened patrol cap. She'd been here for months, training soldiers on the kind of combat the manuals only mentioned in theory: close, brutal, and personal. The kind of fight that happened when the range closed to zero. But her orders had changed 2 days ago. No explanation, just a curt message from the new commanding officer, Major Rourke, reassigning her to base readiness oversight, a glorified inventory clerk with no operational duties. It was the kind of move that told you more about a man than his uniform did. Rourke was a shooter from way back, long-range sniper, medals lined up like fence posts on his chest. In his mind, a fight was won from half a mile out, not with hands, elbows, or knees. And Elena Vega was, to him, a relic. The base moved in a slow rhythm that morning, soldiers running pre-deployment checks, mechanics shouting over the clatter of tools, comms techs hunched over flickering screens. Elena was crossing the yard toward the armory when Rourke's voice cracked through the air. "Sergeant Vega, front and center." His tone carried the weight of command and the edge of theater. This wasn't going to be a quiet conversation. She walked over, eyes steady, hands relaxed at her sides. He was flanked by two of his men, one holding a clipboard, the other her service rifle. Rourke tapped the weapon's receiver with the back of his knuckle, then looked to the small crowd of soldiers who had already begun drifting closer, sensing a show. "During yesterday's sweep, we observed a lapse in weapons discipline," he said, his voice pitched to carry. "This rifle was found unsecured in the readiness bay." The words slid through the air like oil, slick and deliberate. Elena's jaw tightened just slightly, the only betrayal of the fact she knew exactly what he was doing. That rifle had been on her shoulder the entire time she'd been in the bay yesterday. She'd triple-checked it. If it had been found leaning against a wall, someone had put it there for him to find. Rourke didn't pause long enough for her to respond. "As a result, I'm ordering this weapon held for safety review. Until further notice, Sergeant, you will not be issued a rifle." A ripple of murmurs passed through the assembled soldiers. Stripping a combat instructor of her weapon was more than an administrative move, it was a public statement. Elena didn't argue. She didn't ask for proof or demand an explanation. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable, and gave the barest nod. Rourke smiled faintly, mistaking her silence for submission. Dismissed. She turned on her heel and walked away, her pace measured, almost lazy. Inside, her thoughts moved in sharper, faster lines. They thought she'd been disarmed. They thought they'd put her on a shelf. But Elena Vega had never needed a rifle to win a fight. And when the time came, she knew exactly how she'd prove it. The blackout came without warning. 1 second, the base hummed with the constant noise of generators, radios, and distant machinery. The next, everything went black and silent, except for the wind gnawing at the walls. A heartbeat later, the night exploded. Distant gunfire cracked in short, urgent bursts, and shouts tore through the darkness. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, someone was hammering at the eastern wall. Elena Vega was halfway across the yard when the first explosion hit. The concussion rattled her teeth and sent a bloom of orange fire into the sky. Floodlights flickered once and died, plunging the base into shadows broken only by muzzle flashes. The comms tower went dark. In the sudden chaos, soldiers scattered, some to their posts, others ducking for cover as tracer rounds tore overhead. She moved toward the motor pool, intent on getting to the emergency weapons cache inside. But before she could reach it, a metallic clang echoed through the bay. The heavy side door slammed shut, sealing her in. The faint glow from the open service door died as a shadow filled the frame. 4 men slipped inside in quick succession, their rifles low but ready. A 5th followed, heavier set, wearing the kind of quiet authority that marked him as their commander. Their movements were practiced, trained. This wasn't random chaos, this was a breach team. Elena's eyes swept the space in a glance. The armory locker in the corner was padlocked, no rifle, no sidearm. The room smelled of oil and cold metal. Hand tools hung from a pegboard. A broken mop handle leaned in the corner. A half-empty fuel canister sat by the workbench. A scattering of bolts glinted on the floor near her boots. The men spread out slowly, rifles trained lazily in her direction, their confidence almost palpable. The commander gave her a once-over and smiled without warmth. "No gun," he said, his accent thick, his voice amused. "No problem for us." One of the younger fighters chuckled and nudged the man beside him. "She's just a supply sergeant, probably never threw a punch in her life." Elena didn't answer. She stood in the center of the garage, hands relaxed, feet just apart. The light from a single flickering emergency bulb above painted half her face in shadow. She took a breath, slow and deep, and let her shoulders roll ever so slightly. It was a movement so small most wouldn't notice a shift of her stance. Toes angled, weight balanced over the balls of her feet. Her chin dipped just enough to narrow her line of sight. For anyone watching closely, it was the kind of adjustment a fighter made before the first move, the one that decided whether you survived or bled on the floor. The commander's smirk widened. He thought he was watching prey settle into resignation. He didn't know he'd just stepped into the beginning of an 83-second lesson in why Sergeant Elena Vega had never needed a rifle to end a fight. The first man moved in fast, his boots slapping the concrete, the muzzle of his rifle swinging up to level at her chest. Elena didn't step back. She pivoted on her heel, one hand snapping out to grab the rusted oil can from the workbench. Her thumb punched the brittle seam, and a pressurized spray hissed into the air, catching him full in the eyes. He roared, stumbling, his weapon clattering against the floor. She drove her knee upward into his gut, then higher, folding his head down into the rising point of her other knee. His body dropped like wet canvas. The second man came at her from the right, thinking she was still tangled with his partner. She was already moving. Her hand closed around the broken mop handle, its splintered end rough in her grip. She swung low, snapping it sideways into his kneecap. The joint gave with a sickening pop, his scream cutting the air. Before he could fall, she pivoted again, the momentum flowing up her shoulders as her other hand plucked a bolt from the floor and flicked it hard, fast, like a dart. It struck the third man above the ear with the crack of metal on bone. His head snapped sideways, eyes glassing over. He staggered, then dropped to one knee, the rifle in his hands hanging useless. Elena closed the space, caught the weapon, and yanked it from his grip. She didn't fire. Instead, she popped the slide free with a practiced motion and swung the heavy steel frame into the fourth man's jaw. The impact sent him crashing backward into a stack of crates, his legs folding beneath him. The commander had hung back, watching the fight shift from confidence to confusion in seconds. Now he was drawing his pistol, the gleam of the barrel steady in the dim light. Elena's gaze flicked left. Half buried under the workbench lay a shard of broken mirror, edges jagged, surface catching the faint glow from the single emergency bulb. She snatched it up with her left hand, angling it toward his face. The beam of light lanced into his eyes. He flinched, just enough. She closed the distance, ducking under the arc of his arm, and slammed his wrist against the steel cabinet behind him. The pistol clanged to the floor. Her elbow came up, driving into the side of his head. His knees buckled, and she guided him down just far enough to send the back of his skull into the cabinet's corner. He went still. The garage fell silent, except for the faint hiss of the oil dripping to the floor. Elena straightened, scanning the room. 5 bodies, all breathing but out cold. Not one shot fired. She walked to the wall clock mounted above the tool rack. The second hand ticked forward with indifferent precision. From the moment the first man lunged to the moment the commander hit the floor, 3 seconds. She exhaled slowly, her pulse steady, and let the mop handle roll from her fingers to the ground. Boots pounded against the concrete outside the motor pool, the heavy rhythm of a full response team moving in tight formation. The side door burst open, light from a dozen flashlights slicing into the dim garage. Rifles swept the room, voices barked commands, then faltered into stunned silence. Elena stood alone in the center, her breathing steady, her uniform untouched by so much as a wrinkle. Around her, 5 armed men lay sprawled in various stages of unconsciousness, weapons scattered like discarded tools. The smell of oil and sweat hung in the air, and the faint metallic tang of blood mixed with the scent of the fuel canister she'd upended. "What the hell?" one soldier muttered, lowering his weapon slightly as his eyes darted between the bodies. Before anyone could answer, the security chief pushed in, tablet in hand, the screen playing silent footage from the overhead camera. The grainy black and white image showed the entire fight from start to finish, Elena moving with cold precision, dismantling the breach team in just over a minute. No wasted motion, no hesitation. It looked more like choreography than combat, except the ending was anything but staged. By the time Major Rourke arrived, the murmurs had turned into open disbelief. He stepped into the garage, his eyes sweeping over the scene, settling on her with something that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite contempt. It was calculation. He knew everyone was watching. "Sergeant Vega," he said, voice clipped, "you neutralized all 5 intruders, alone." She didn't move. "Yes, sir." His jaw shifted slightly, as if the words he was about to say had to be wrestled past his pride. "Your decisive action likely prevented further breach of the base interior. That's commendable." He paused, letting the statement hang just long enough for the others to hear it. "I'll see that it's noted in your record." The tone was official, but there was no mistaking the edge praise given because the alternative would cost him more than swallowing his pride. He gave a short nod to the security team and turned to leave, but not before catching the stares of the soldiers lining the doorway. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at her. The skepticism she'd felt since Rourke's arrival was gone, replaced with something sharper respect, edged with the awareness they'd underestimated her badly. A few exchanged glances, and one of the younger privates shook his head with a grin. 83 seconds, he murmured, just loud enough for the phrase to stick. By the time she walked out of the garage, the nickname had already taken root, the 83-second soldier. She didn't linger to bask in it. She crossed the yard, the noise of activity returning around her, and stepped into the armory. The quartermaster, still wide-eyed from the security footage, didn't speak as she reached for her rifle. She checked the chamber, slung it over her shoulder, and turned toward the door. No speech, no smile, just the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to prove anything anymore. The wind followed her out, carrying the unspoken truth that no one would ever try to take her weapon from her again.